Panalo. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start our program. Please settle down. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to the National West Philippine Sea Summit in commemorating the 10th year anniversary of the South China Sea Arbitral Awards. To give a brief background, this is again once in commemoration with the 10th anniversary of the landmark of the 2016 South China Sea Arbitral Award. The WPS Foundation, in collaboration with the National Task Force West Philippine Sea, other government institutions, academia, and the private sector will convene the National West Philippine Sea Summit from today up until tomorrow, July 8 and 9, here at the Forbes Ballroom in Conrad, Manila.
The multi-sectoral summit will pair capacity-building lectures on the law of the sea and the 2016 Arbitral Award, delivered by renowned experts and academics from around the world serving as resource persons, with a national policy dialogue and a town hall on Philippine approaches to the West Philippine Sea and related aspects of the country's China policy.
And to start our program, to give the opening remarks and the agenda setup, may we request the commander of the PCG West Philippine Sea Transparency Group, Rear Admiral J. Tristan Tarriela, Philippine Coast Guard. Let's give him a big round of applause.
To Justice Antonio Carpio, sir, the foundation of what we're celebrating today and the foundation of our fight in the West Philippine Sea. It's nice to see you here as we celebrate the 10th year commemoration of the 2016 Arbitral Award. To the Deputy Director General of the National Security Council, General Nestor Jerico, sir. To the former Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, General Bautista, sir. Another former Chief of Staff, former Superintendent of the Philippine Military Academy, General Edelberto Adan, sir. Distinguished guests, fellow workers in the government, ladies and gentlemen, isang magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. On behalf of the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea and our partners in the academe, the policy community, and the private sector, welcome to the National West Philippine Sea Summit, convened to mark the 10th year of the 2016 South China Sea Arbitral Award. 10 years on, the meaning of the award is not in doubt. It is final, it is binding, and it remains the clearest affirmation of our rules-based maritime order under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But an award does not defend itself. It has to be explained, defended, and applied, and not only in diplomatic notes and policy briefs. It has to live in our classrooms, in our newsrooms, in our coastal communities, and in the national conversation. That is precisely why the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea and the We Protect Our Seas Foundation of Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel designed this summit the way we did, to pair UNCLOS capacity building with policy dialogue. The law gives us our foundation. The dialogue turns that foundation into public understanding, a sound national security strategy, and a principled foreign policy. Because effective policy begins with a clear grasp of the law And that understanding cannot remain lack inside a room full of experts. If you have been following the pages of the Chinese embassy, in which they are my favorite Chinese embassy page right now, here in Manila, and their state-controlled media, which now even speak to us in Filipino or in Tagalog. Imagine having that effort, no, of translating English to Tagalog so that we can understand the lies and misinformation that they are posting. Then you already know that the West Philippine Sea is not only a contest over territory or maritime entitlements or operations at sea. It is also a contest fought in the information space. For years, we have watched a persistent effort to distort what UNCLOS says, to diminish the 2016 Arbitral Award, and to lend legitimacy to claims that have no basis whatsoever in the international law. This information erodes public confidence, muddles our national debate, and clears the ground for malign influence to take root. So, the most effective way to keep the Arbitral Award alive is to keep the Filipino people informed. Kailangan alam ng ating sambayanang Pilipino na nasa tama tayo, hindi dahil Pilipino tayo, kundi ang ating paninindigan ay naaayon sa batas sa ilalim ng international law. A public that understands what UNCLOS says, what the Annex 7 Tribunal decided in 2016, what it did not decide, and why our position is legally sound, is a public that is harder to mislead, harder to divide, and better prepared to resist malign influence. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from distinguished experts who flew to Manila to help us separate fact from fiction and to draw the line between what is lawful and what is not. We begin at the source, the history of the law of the sea, and the evolution of global ocean governance, with a globally renowned UNCLOS authority, Professor Ronan Long, Director of the Global Ocean Institute at the World Maritime University. He will place UNCLOS within the long arc of ocean governance and remind us why the convention has earned its name, the Constitution of the Oceans. Professor Long will then take us into baselines, the territorial sea, and associated navigational regimes, how maritime zones are actually measured, and how the law balances a coastal state's sovereignty against the rights of international navigation. I suspect that by late morning, we will be able to understand rather why no single country can simply draw 9, 10, or even 11 lines across the sea and declare everything inside them as if it's their own. In the afternoon, Professor Makoto Seta of Waseda University will lead the session 3, the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf, the sovereign rights of coastal states over their resources, and the freedoms that these states retain. I look forward in particular to hearing our Japanese colleague on the Philippines-Japan exclusive economic zone negotiation that Beijing has spent their past weeks criticizing. For the session 4, it will be on the dispute settlement under UNCLOS. It will be delivered by Professor Sokwo Lee, who is the Dean and Professor of International Law at Inha University Law School and one of the Korea's leading voices on the law of the sea. He will walk us through the mechanism UNCLOS provides for resolving disputes, including compulsory arbitration, which is exactly why the award is final, binding, and must be complied with by both China and the Philippines. Later today, Dr. Bill Hayden, our favorite speaker for the past 3 years already, of Chatham House will lead the session 5. He will discuss the modern origins of China's South China Sea claims and lies, showing how so many of these expansive claims arose not from ancient, continuous practice, but from modern political, cartographic, and bureaucratic decisions. In short, not so ancient at all, because these are just made-up stories of the Chinese Communist Party. Tomorrow, Professor Clive Schofield of the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security will lead session 6. It is the regime of islands under Article 121 and the 2016 Arbitral Award. The legal distinctions among islands, rocks, and low tide elevation, and what each means for maritime entitlement in the South China Sea will also be discussed. And tonight, our own Justice Antonio Carpio will present the historical maps that prove our territorial claims are every bit as strong as our UNCLOS-based maritime claims, if only we can summon the political will to press them. We're also honored to receive the keynote addresses from our National Security Advisor, Secretary Eduardo Oban, this evening, and from our Secretary of National Defense, Secretary Gilbert Chodoro, tomorrow during lunchtime. To every lecturer and resource person who traveled to be here, maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Your presence is itself a statement that the defense of international law is a shared commitment, and that in the 21st century, the oceans must be governed by law and not by coercion and force. I think it's a Chinese embassy doing some magic here. Over the next 2 days, I ask you to engage without hesitation, to ask the hard questions, and carry this conversation far beyond this ballroom. The 2016 Arbitral Award is one of the Philippines' greatest legal and diplomatic achievement in our human history. But its relevance 10 years from now will depend entirely on what we choose to do with it today. Again, maraming salamat po sa inyo, and welcome to the National West Philippine Sea Summit.
Thank you very much, sir.
At this point, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now proceed with the first session of our summit. And for our first session, the history of the law of the sea and the evolution of global ocean governance. This session provides a foundational overview of the historical development and contemporary structure of the law of the sea, tracing its evolution from early doctrines such as Mare Liberum and Mare Clausum to the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And to give us the lecture, may we request the WMU-Sasakawa Global Ocean Institute of the World Maritime University. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the director, Professor Ronan Long. A hand, please.
Rear Admiral Tarriela, Justice Carpio, former and serving members of the armed services, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. First and foremost, it's a great privilege and honor to be here this morning. My first time in the Philippines. I come from Ireland. We have 35,000 Filipinos working in Ireland, many in the health service, and many of my own family work in medicine. And they said to convey to this audience this morning the warmest thanks and gratitude for all your compatriots that work in the health service in Ireland. So I'd like to do that. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel, and the WS Foundation for organizing this wonderful symposium, which marks the Annex 7 Arbitration Award. And as you've heard from the Rear Admiral, a very significant milestone in terms of the dispute settlement procedures, which are compulsory under the Law of the Sea Convention. Perhaps there's one other point I'd like to make this morning is, I suppose it's a lawyer's point, which is a general disclaimer. I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, and of course I'm very happy to do so. I'd also say on my opening slide there, you see the World Maritime University in beautiful Malmö, Sweden. And my colleague, President Max Mejia, is from the Philippines, and he's president of the World Maritime University, which is part of the International Maritime Organization. So I'd like to acknowledge that. And I've been set a very pleasant task this morning by my dear colleague Jeffrey, which is really to tell the story of the Law of the Sea. And leading up to the Law of the Sea Convention, the compulsory dispute settlement bodies and processes, as well as the broader landscape of ocean governance, and really to set the scene for everything else that follows today. Now let me see. Yeah, I'd start here with an opening slide of the Artemis mission, lunar exploration mission recently conducted by NASA. And I grew up in the era of the great Apollo missions, and I have watching this in black and white television a way back in the early 1970s. I was quite struck on the current mission that the most, shall we say, incisive comments by the astronauts were not about where they were going, but where they'd come from, the ocean. And they spoke about the blue planet in the black void of space. And I think that's very, very important because in spatial terms, I think most people in the room know 70% of the ocean surface or 70% of the world's surface is oceans. And in actual fact, is a point that was noted in the recent advisory opinion on climate change. Over 95% of the biosphere, the living space, is in the ocean. So we don't really reflect on that because we're terrestrial animals. So I suppose the context, that sets the broader context for what we're going to discuss today and tomorrow, right? The ocean is very significant, and not only in the context of the history of the planet, but it's also very important for a rules-based international order, which Admiral Tarriela pointed out in his opening remarks this morning. Essentially, I'd like to talk to 5 particular topics. I think I have one slide for general context. Everybody in the room knows the general context for ocean affairs. Secondly, I'd talk about the history of the Law of the Sea, and what a wonderful history. And various chapters, and indeed the Annex 7 arbitration is a very important chapter in the development of the Law of the Sea. Thirdly, I'd turn to the maritime jurisdictional zones. And fourthly, I would speak about the convention. And I would say it's the mother of all conventions. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is really the apogee or the high point of international lawmaking. And it's wonderful that you've organized this symposium, first and foremost by tracing the importance of this convention for the Philippines. You've shaped the negotiations of the convention, and indeed you're shaping its implementation. And lastly, maybe I would make, I think I have one slide on the Maritime Zones Act, which is really important, a development of national legislation here in the Philippines. At the context, I think everybody knows the general context. As I've said, 70% of the Earth's surface, it's kind of about, it's a kind of a difficult figure to think about. And occasionally I tell my students in Malmo, the first time I sailed from Ireland to the United States, we built a boat, a race boat in Ireland, and we sailed it down. It took 3 weeks. So I think with jet travel now, we forget maybe the spatial extent of the ocean. Quite clearly, it's very, very important for climate and extreme weather events, such as the typhoon that was experienced here yesterday. And this link between oceans climate is something which was the focus of a recent advisory opinions of both the International Court and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. It's home to wonderful biodiversity, ecosystems and marine species. And I suppose ecosystem services is a very important topic in the law of the sea in terms of delivering all these services, such as the air we breathe, and indeed moderating and mediating the climate. Has mineral and petroleum resources, and that's a key issue, particularly in relation to the functions of one of the institutions that was set up by the Law of the Sea Convention, and that's the International Seabed Authority, and I'll reference that later in my talk. And of course, it provides a very important source of protein. We have to be very careful with these figures. For instance, I worked in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and in Sierra Leone, they get 90% of their protein out of the ocean. And so, ocean issues in Sierra Leone, this is about food security first and foremost, and we need to reflect on that very carefully. And of course, it transports all trade, and the Philippines is the home to many seafarers across the world, and we would like to acknowledge that. And of course, it's the highway for world security and stability in the world. So, not an inclusive or an exclusive list. It's a representative list of the importance and the context of the ocean. Now, my principal thesis this morning is that all of this is facilitated by the navigation rights and freedoms advanced by the Convention. And I wrote an article recently to mark the 40th anniversary of a very prestigious journal. I think my colleague, Professor Sekou Lee, has an article in the same edition. And what I said in that article was the navigational rights and freedoms are really the crown jewels in the Convention. They're the very basis of the Convention. And without these navigation rights and freedoms, we wouldn't have a Convention, or we wouldn't have a rules-based international legal order. Believe it or not, certainly in a European context, we trace the early history of the law of the sea back to the imperial powers in Europe, the great imperial powers of Spain and the great imperial powers of Portugal. And extraordinarily, they divided the world into two spheres of influence in relation to Spain to the west, the America and Portugal to the east, Africa and Asia. And of course, this was quite problematic under the first treaty, the Treaty of Tarriela, which really put in a dividing line in the Atlantic, to be followed subsequently by the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529 to resolve what they referred to at that particular time as the Moluccan Islands issues. And two spheres of influence. And obviously, we could have more or less finished the lecture here if this was to continue. But of course, the law had to evolve, and this was very much a projection of a European imperial power at that particular time. I think the Admiral referenced this. The great first treatise in the law of the sea came about by the work of three scholars. Firstly, Hugo Grotius, Hugo de Groot, in his Dutch name, articulating views really for the Dutch East India Company, the freedom of navigation, mare liberum. And really that was the foundation of the law of the sea progressively thereafter. Of course, it was contested. And I instance John Selden, mare clausum, that the sea could be enclosed similar to land territory. And of course, the great German scholar Birkenshock in 1702 did De Minimis Maris, where he put forward the thesis that states or countries could control what they possessed. And essentially that was to be decided by coastal artillery, and that was the foundation of the cannon shot rule. The states could exert control over a narrow band of sea adjacent to their coasts. And essentially that is the foundation of the territorial sea. One thing I would say about the Battle of the Books is mare clausum, freedom of the sea, and or mare liberum, freedom of the sea, and mare clausum, the enclosure of the sea, that has remained a tension right up to the current times. And indeed, when we look at the regulation of the sea in international treaties, and indeed in relation to the practice of states, we're looking at how this balance is being achieved and maintained. And I suppose when we look at the Law of the Sea Convention, it's really, it strikes a very fine balance between those particular interests, although of course they were articulated as a theoretical resolution of particular viewpoints in relation to the ocean. Now, I would say that this European-centric approach to the law of the sea is highly criticized, as being contradictory in many respects, and that freedom of the seas existed worldwide. It existed in the Pacific with the Polynesians. It existed here in the Philippines. It existed in the Indian Ocean long before there were any Europeans. And I cite on the side the great work of Professor Anand, this Indian scholar, really the forebearer of third world approaches to international law, who points out a contrary view on the evolution and the genesis of these freedoms, origin and development of the law of the sea. And I commend always to my students in Malmo that they have to read this text. And these arguments are very important, that we don't conceptualize the law of the sea as something as European-centric in terms of its progressive development, and indeed in relation to its origins. Now, that being said, it is associated with the Westphalian system. It's a state-centric system, and it really came to the fore after World War II with President Truman. Prior to World War II, there were a number of codification attempts, including at the Hague Conference. They were unsuccessful. But the first major development in terms of state practice was came about because of the Truman Proclamation in relation to the continental shelf. And of course, that triggered state practice elsewhere, including in Latin America, most notably. And that led subsequently into very important codification processes where intergovernmental conferences first and foremost sought to consolidate international laws as it was then, and then to develop the law. So they were lawmaking conferences. So starting with the Truman Proclamation, and the Truman Proclamation, believe it or not, on the continental shelf is a very brief two paragraphs. And and I've cited them on the next two slides. And what it states is, having concern for the urgency of conserving and prudently utilizing its natural resources, the government of the United States regards the natural resources of the subsoil and seabed of the continental shelf beneath the high seas, but contiguous to its coast of the United States, is appertaining to the United States. Appertaining means belonging to the United States, and subject to its jurisdiction and control. Essentially, what was behind the Truman Proclamation was the pressing requirement for the United States to exert control over the hydrocarbon resources, in particular, of the continental shelf in areas such as the Gulf of Mexico in particular. And of course, there's reference now I see in the United States of the Gulf of Mexico to being the Gulf of America. But of course, I don't have a particular view on that. Secondly, the interesting thing about the Truman Proclamation was really relevant to what we're going to talk about today, both this morning and indeed later today and again tomorrow, is it didn't fundamentally change the character of the high seas as an area that was open to all and that was subject to the freedom of navigation. And interestingly, when we look behind the Truman Proclamation as to what's the, shall we say, the rationale or what's the justification, we see it's the justification was on foot of that the continental shelf was contiguous to the United States, and secondly, that it was reasonable to do so to assert the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the United States over the continental shelf, and of course, without impeaching those high seas freedoms. Now, what we saw subsequently is we saw a whole raft of assertions of coastal state jurisdiction, particularly by Latin American states, including Mexico, Argentina. But quite crucially, 3 states came together and agreed and signed the Santiago Declaration in 1952, namely Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and they claimed 200 nautical mile zones. And where they said not only did they exercise sovereignty over the seabed, but also sovereignty and jurisdiction over the water column. Of course, this was protested by the United States and Great Britain, as it then was. And of course, it was a proclamation directed towards the rest of the world. And it was lodged as much later as a treaty in 1976. So I suppose, right, when we're thinking about the high points of state practice, first and foremost, we think about Truman Proclamation, but not far behind that comes the Santiago Declaration in terms of states asserting their jurisdiction and control over sea areas adjacent to their coasts. Now, that led in effect to the first codification attempt. The first United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea convened in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations in 1958. Right, I have a very important slide later, which I would like you to take note of. But at the first conference, there was 86 states participating. So it was a very much a very different world in 1958. And the Global South, as we say today, very poorly represented, and their interests really weren't reflected in the outcomes of the first conference, which led to 4 conventions: a convention on the territorial sea and contiguous zone, convention on the high seas, convention on fishing and living resources of the high seas, a convention on the continental shelf, and an optional protocol on the settlement of disputes. And my distinguished colleague, Professor Seiko Lee, who's going to talk about dispute settlement. Actually, the optional protocol never came into force. There were only 36 states that signed up to it. Now, crucial about the first conference was it failed to come to agreement on 2 key issues. Firstly, the breadth of the territorial sea, and secondly, in relation to coastal state jurisdiction over fisheries in areas adjacent to coastal states. So 2 key issues, and that necessitated the second United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea. 2 years later, everybody comes back to Geneva, and there is a proposal put to the floor by the United States and Canada. And of a 6-mile limit, maximum extent of the territorial 6 miles, and a maximum extent of fisheries jurisdiction 6 further miles beyond that. And that proposal failed by 1 vote. It required a two-thirds majority. If they had agreed it, maybe the law of the sea would be very different nowadays. And, but in a way, it left the issues unresolved, and that triggered a whole range of issues. Now, in parallel with this, the International Court of Justice, and of course, is of fundamental importance to the global legal order, and has a very crucial role to play as one of those dispute settlement bodies for the law of the sea. It had been seized with very important cases dealing with ocean affairs. Indeed, the first case it dealt with straits used for international navigation, the Corfu Channel, where it set out certain premises about the exercise of navigation in straits, which are since have been codified by the convention. We also had a very important judgment in Norway versus Great Britain, or Great Britain versus Norway, in relation to the Anglo-Norwegian fishery case about the use of strait baselines, which were upheld by the court. And I'll come back to this topic later this morning. And of course, then quite later, this crucially important series of cases on the delimitation of the continental shelf in the North Sea. So the jurisprudence is moving ahead of the codification process. And of course, the codification process is an international lawmaking process. And so this, of course, was something which had a very important bearing on the convening of the third conference. I would say it was clearly evident by the 60s that there were a number of inherent difficulties in relation to the 4 conventions that had been agreed at the first conference. Firstly, the definition of the continental shelf was on the basis of bathymetry as well as an exploitability test. And that was inherently unfair to developing states that didn't have those technologies to exploit the continental shelf. There was no agreement on areas beyond national jurisdiction, particularly in relation to the exploitation of mineral resources, and indeed those mineral resources would have been open to all. And of course, as you will see in a later slide, the world had changed. There were more independent states, particularly in Africa and indeed in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And there was inherent complexity in the geopolitical situation within the world, and where these dominant views of the world, which were very evident in relation to rules-based order, which we saw in the 1958 convention, weren't really reflective of the new world that was transitioning into place, certainly by the late 1960s. In addition to that, a very famous speech, Ambassador Arvid Pardo, who is celebrated Maltese ambassador. You see a photograph of me on the slide there, beside his statue outside Imlay in Malta. And he made a very important speech to the General Assembly. And I ask my students always to read the speech, because it took 4 hours, but it really provided a philosophical foundation for the subsequent negotiations, particularly in relation to the common heritage of mankind as it was then articulated, but of course, as we know nowadays, the common heritage of humankind, and that this principle would pertain to the resources, the mineral resources of the seabed, that those resources would belong to humankind. That's to say to everybody here in this room, a very novel concept at its origins, had been applied previously in relation to the moon and so forth. Now, the ambassador's Pardo's speech, it really triggered a couple of developments at the United Nations. One being the formation of the Permanent Committee on the Peaceful Uses of our of the ocean and beyond, of the ocean floor and subsoil beyond national jurisdiction. And that met right up to 1973. Quite an open-ended process, but within that there were very important UNGA resolutions, and I would reference two. One on a moratorium on seabed mining until the legal regimes had been developed and evolved. And then secondly, of course, it codified the second UNGA resolution, which codified the principle of the common heritage of mankind as it then was. That really, I suppose, triggered and brought about the development of the Third Law of the Sea Conference. And the Third Law of the Sea Conference, for everybody in the room, is really the greatest lawmaking conference we've had in the world. And I'd like to pick up on a point that Admiral Tarriela made in his opening remarks there. Really, we've had nothing like anything like the third conference in international law sense. We don't really have something that was so expansive in its scope that brought the international community together and really provided the foundation for a rules-based international legal order. And the first president of the conference, Ambassador Amersingh from Sri Lanka, in his opening statement said states were seeking not charity but justice based on the equity and the rights of sovereign countries in respect of the sea. And another quote from that speech was that freedom oppresses and the law protects. And that is very important because, you know, I've put at the bottom of the slide, and I suppose in terms of conceptually understanding and the development of the law of the sea, one has to say, if we go back to 1958, there were 82 United Nations members. By 1973, it's 135. That's at the start of the conference. And by 1982, when the convention was adopted, 157. And of course, today we're up at 193. So the global legal order has changed, and the interests and needs of states has evolved considerably. And I suppose the understanding the narrative of the Law of the Sea Convention is the Law of the Sea Convention needed to address the needs of all states. And that's very, very important by providing a rules-based international legal order for the ocean. And one of the things we see in the preamble to the convention, that all ocean issues are interrelated and need to be considered as a whole. And I think that's a key aspect of the development of the rules in the convention, and indeed a key aspect of the development of international law as it applies to the ocean sense. I don't think the clicker is working. Okay, we're good, and we're at the third conference, 1973, and you can see two photographs of sessions underway at the United Nations. Very exciting. The Philippines played a crucial role in the third conference, and I will indicate that. Prior to discussing that, I'd like to discuss a number of features about the processes underway at the third conference and some of the issues that had to be overcome. We generally refer to this as UNCLOS 3, of course, which shouldn't be confused with UNCLOS, which is the convention. Extraordinarily, and I think Justice Carpio would find this quite striking, as do all wonderful international lawyers, it is started without a draft text, and it's very hard for international lawyers, any lawyers, to negotiate without a text. And we can compare and contrast that. The International Law Commission had prepared text for the first conference. Secondly, the large number of states that were participating changed the dynamic. And it started with an agenda of 25 issues. Many of those issues carried forward from the work of the Seabed Committee. And then they came up with very novel procedures, consensus-based procedures, no voting under what was then called as a gentleman's agreement, a gentleman and ladies agreement, I dare say, in today's world, so as that everything would be agreed before there would be a vote, and that there would be a cooling off period before a vote. And I think that was sensible advice. Lastly, it was a package deal. What that means is there would be concessions on certain issues because there'd be gains in other areas. And that's very important when we consider the interpretation and application of the convention today. It's a package. You have to accept everything in the convention as part of that package, because if you don't, you disturb the balance. So, and then of course, in 1975, the work of the three committees of the conference pooled the draft text into the single negotiating text, and that formed the basis of the negotiations thereafter. Conference was led by group approach, and I cite, for instance, the Coastal States Group, very important. Philippines was a very significant member of that group. The Continental Shelf Group, the Margineers, as they were known, dealing with Margineers issues. But quite crucially for this audience, the Archipelagic State Group really was at the heart of the conference, and you have to understand that without their proposals being reflected in the text, we really wouldn't have a Law of the Sea convention. And there was a collegium which had 6 members, which worked with the President, Ambassador Amersing, and of course Tommy Cove for the last 2 sessions. Non-governmental organizations played an important role in terms of out of plenary sessions, informing and helping delegations and so forth. Extraordinarily, it took 9 years to conclude. Sessions were up to 6 weeks duration, normally in the spring and the fall. And Ambassador Mann Hayes, our head of delegation, his wife said she would never forgive him for those 9 years, disappearing to New York for 6 weeks at a time, when telephone calls to New York were inherently expensive. And now, what I would also say is, and this is a real danger in international lawmaking processes, is the treaty-making process was being overtaken by state practice. Or certain developments by the treaty-making process, such as the development of the concept of the exclusive economic zone, was finding state practice, which was being deemed as being customary international law, separate to the treaty, and therefore binding on binding on states. Now, inherent within the treaty-making process was the interests of archipelagic states, and this issue, I suppose, was articulated certainly by 1956 by the Philippines, by 1957 by Indonesia, and the issue then was how would the Anglo-Norwegian fishery case, which resolved their baselines issue, if it enclosed mid-ocean archipelagic states within baselines, how would it affect navigational rights and freedoms? And of course, this would pose challenges for maritime states and those great maritime powers. And position was, of course, that archipelagic states were divided by water, and outside the narrow band of territorial seas, this area between the islands that make up an archipelagic state was high seas, and of course where the freedom of navigation applied, and that was very, very problematic for archipelagic states. And of course, needs no introduction to this audience. These views were articulated by a really eminent delegation here on the archipelagic states issue. And I think in terms of Minister Tolentino, he's seen as the father, the parent of the archipelagic statehood. And he was assisted by very eminent members of his delegation. And the Philippines had to work with like-minded states, including Indonesia and Mauritius. I think what's very important to forget is, or not to forget, but which is often forgotten in the literature, is the concept of archipelagic statehood preceded actually the first conference, but wasn't addressed by the first conference. Secondly, it was taken up by the Seabed Committee, and the Seabed Committee was the precursor for the Third Law of the Sea Conference. And I suppose my final point here is archipelagic statehood and the provisions in Part 4 of the Convention are an essential ingredient, a vital part of the Convention. We see nowadays that we wouldn't have had successful negotiations if this issue hadn't been resolved. And of course, the grounds for doing so were articulated both by the Philippines and Indonesia, and Ambassadors Satyanandan, a great friend of mine, the late Satyanandan from Fiji. I was chairing that second committee, was really in a strong position to provide leadership from the front in supporting Philippines, Indonesia, Mauritius at the third conference. And these interests are known to everybody in the room. Firstly, I think for political reasons and security reasons, historical reasons, the natural features of archipelagic states, their economic interests, their interests in the environment, and of course, the very important interests in relation to natural resources. I'm going to talk maybe in the second lecture this morning about archipelagic states, and there's three very important features in international law. Firstly, we get a very clear definition of what's an archipelagic state in the Convention, and everybody has to be familiar with that who is going to work on law of the sea issues. That is very, very fundamental to our understanding. And there are two significant other features. Firstly, archipelagic baselines, the creation of international law and codified in the Convention, and of course archipelagic waters, which is sui generis. It's a unique jurisdictional regime, and that has very important attributes which we're going to turn to in the second lecture. I suppose for the purpose of this lecture, I think conceptually you can think of archipelagic statehood as unifying, as a unifying feature for archipelagic states worldwide, and a crucially important development in the law of the sea. Now, the sessions in New York came to a hiatus in 1981 when President Reagan was elected in the United States, and the United States, including the State Department, reviewed progress in relation to negotiation of the convention, and they had concerns in particular in relation to the seabed mineral regime for the international seabed area. That's areas beyond national jurisdiction, and they called for a vote. And Ambassador Mann-Hayes told me the morning, he said there was a 2-day cooling off period, but he told me the morning of the vote, it was raining in New York and there was outages. And he says a lot of, in UN Plaza 1, which is the hotel, the elevators weren't working. A lot of delegations were stuck in elevators. And he says nobody was talking to anybody else. That they everybody was, after investing nine years in this process, they were being put to the test. And he says there was really no exchange of views as to how people or delegations were voting. And of course, the voting was called, and he said it went up on the screen, and everybody that's been to the plenary rooms in New York for voting will know, right, that it's like a clicker that goes up, and extraordinarily, there was only 4 states voted against the draft treaty, There were 17 abstaining states, dare I say it, mainly European states. I've put their names on the slide in relation to the abstentions, and the draft text was carried and open for signature on the 10th of December, a very important day. And I am so happy to tell this audience that the Philippines negotiated in good faith and was within the first dozen of states to ratify. And that's very important in terms of you negotiate, but you have to honor those negotiations by acting on behalf of the instrument that you've negotiated on. And so that's a very significant milestone. I have a really wonderful statement, and I've put it on the slide, but I'm at that stage of my life where my eyesight is really poor now from reading books. So I can't read the slide, but I actually know it from memory. And it's the statement that was delivered by the Philippines delegation in Montego Bay, which was a very important a meeting at the final session of the conference when it was open for signature. And it really set out the position and the fundamental importance of archipelagic statehood, what these negotiations meant for the Philippines, and indeed the whole rationale. So I would encourage everybody in the room to study this statement, because it really provides the foundation for archipelagic statehood, not only for the Philippines, but for all archipelagic states. And it's inherently important, I think, in studying and understanding the law of the sea. The Rear Admiral mentioned it this morning about the importance of being a student of the law of the sea. I'm a student of the law of the sea. I'm really interested in what states say and do, and this statement really captures the spirit of the archipelagic statehood provisions. And of course, it was a package deal, so there was something in it for everybody. Maritime states, coastal states. EEZ concept was put forward by Kenya. Exclusive economic zone concept, very important concept for coastal states. And of course, the Philippines, not only is an archipelagic state, it's a crucially important coastal state as well. So that's very important in that context. And then big issues in relation to the global commons. Perhaps what's often forgotten is there are very significant provisions in the convention for landlocked and disadvantaged states. And it's something I'm going to do before I retire, is to organize a conference for landlocked and disadvantaged states to see how the world has done in relation to the implementation of those provisions. The convention itself, if you have the legal training, please don't be concerned. It's extremely well drafted. 3 minutes, you're saying. I was late starting. Can you give me 5 minutes? Yes? You're waving a sign. Yeah? Okay, maybe I'll take a few more minutes and I'll get on to key points. Look, archipelagic statehood is in part 4 of the convention. The convention itself has 320 articles, 9 annexes, and extremely well. It divides ocean space on a functional basis, and I'll come back to that. And it attributes and demarcates jurisdiction. It provides for rules of conduct, and it has very important institutional provisions, and it provides, and this is a key aspect, no reservations or exceptions. Problem was the non-acceptance by developing states of Part 11, which dealt with seabed mining, and of course that had to be resolved. 9 key issues had to be addressed, including these mandatory production policies and so forth. And that was resolved by a new implementation agreement, which in effect changes the convention. And I can take some questions on that. Convention almost universal, 172 states and the European Union. Of course, we're missing some key states in relation to accession, or are party to this convention. And United States Senate, a 2/3 majority is required in the United States Senate. I was in the University of Virginia the last time they voted on this issue, and it fell short of that, and it established new institutions, the Law of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg, the International Seabed Authority, and the Commission on the Limits on the Continental Shelf. 2 slides and I'm finished. Dispute settlement is crucially important. It's compulsory. And I suppose as a package deal, this is very important. If you're a party to the convention, you've got to be party to dispute settlement. And we have had a number of disputes, including the Annex 7 arbitration and indeed the Arctic Sunrise case, where 2 very important states parties to the convention haven't appeared in the dispute settlement proceedings, and that's very important to note that. The challenges really relate to new uses, enforcement and compliance. The tribunal itself has 36 cases, has 3 advisory opinions. Climate change is one of the big issues, and now has been, apart from the 94 implementation agreement, has 2 other implementation agreements, the Fish Stocks Agreement and the BBNJ Agreement. And Philippines played a very important part in the BBNJ negotiations. I was there for the 20 years, from the start of that process to the end at all the sessions at the UN. Lastly, and my final slide would be to say to you, the convention is really the parent, the mother of all other treaties. We read the 94 implementation agreement as one text with the convention, and it's supplemented, of course, by very important implementation agreements. I mentioned 2, Fish Stocks Agreement, BBNJ, but also all other rules in international law, including the IMO treaty regime, in excess of 50 international treaties covering the safety and security of shipping. And the Maritime Zones Act here in the Philippines is a hugely important development in national law. And when I was going through it last night, it codifies these very important navigational regimes, and indeed is very important on that, including continental shelf. And Philippines has had a partial submission and a full submission in relation to the continental shelf, and it has received a recommendation and implemented the recommendation in relation to the first submission. And that's very important, that you have codified those provisions in your convention, because you exercise sovereign rights in relation to the shelf, that is to say beyond 200 miles. Okay, I'm a few minutes late finishing out. I was a few minutes late starting, so I do beg your forgiveness. Thank you very much. That's the history of the Law of the Sea. I would say it's a never-ending story, and you've played a fantastic role in this. You continue to do so, and it's a privilege and honor to share the symposium over the next 2 days. Justice Carpio, Admiral, my distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's just really wonderful to be here in Manila for such an important commemoration of the Annex 7 arbitration. So very important developments and great clarity, may I add, in relation to international legal rules coming from the arbitral tribunal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ronan Long. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, we will be having a 10-minute health break. We will resume at 10:20 a.m. Thank you.